Hi, welcome to our week number 4 edition of our Life and Times of Daniel online study. We're so glad that you are able to join us today and have that opportunity for us to dive into this section. So today will be the last of this series of Bible studies. Those first 3 books, I think, really capture that kind of process that Daniel and his friends went through as they lived in a very different culture and the pressure that they felt on their faith. And so that's really the focus of our study. And so thus far we've had the chance to look at chapter 1, in which we talked about that pressure of the enculturation that was trying to be forced upon them, that it became not just a matter of language or literature or learning, but a matter of even dietary food that became a matter of confession and faith. Is that chapter 2, we heard about King Nebuchadnezzar's dreams. What was it that he was truly dreaming of? What was on his heart, on his mind, upon his very worries and fears, as we wrestled with that question of how again does Daniel and his friends live in the midst of those who are so different and so far from them. As that chapter 3, once again, is kind of a cycle of that theme, as we see yet again the world tries to press itself upon us. It tries to force us to fit what it desires, but it is that very calling of the Christian to live not for the very wants or whims of others, to not seek self-glory or self-preservation, but to seek to be faithful in what God has given. And so today let's go ahead and let's take a further look at Daniel chapter 3. And so we begin with verse 1 through 6. That King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits and its breadth 6 cubits. So it's like 90 foot, I think it's by like 90 by 19. Is that he set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent together the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. It said, then the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered for the dedication of the image that the king Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning, fiery furnace." Things get a little heated. Ooh, that was a bad pun. As the things get a little over the top pretty quickly here in Daniel chapter 3. Is that the king just lays it all on the line once again. Just like he threatened the very lives of his wise men in chapter 2, once again he throws down the gauntlet that is there for so many. Because when we begin to think about and discuss this chapter, is that what connections are there between the action of the king in Daniel chapter 3 and his dreams in Daniel chapter 2? That if you look at those closing verses of Daniel 2, that how do they somehow give the very imagery or the very impetus to somehow in some way drive Nebuchadnezzar's actions here in chapter 3? Because what do we see? We see him have a dream of this amazing statue, a head of gold and a body of silver and then bronze and then iron and then clay and iron. Is that we hear this very interpretation that King Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom would be the one of gold, that others would not live up to what it was that had been given to Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. And so we see King Nebuchadnezzar dreaming about these concerns, these worries, these fears about what does his future hold. And God even gives this image of what would come. That one day down the line that a rock not hewn by human hands would indeed destroy this very image of his dream. But it will happen someday in the future. And then King Nebuchadnezzar responds with a little bit of humility, a little bit of praise and honor to Daniel's God, and once again, a little bit of honor and promotion to Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as each of them climb that corporate ladder of Babylon, as God continues to have his hand upon their rise to positions of influence and authority. And so what do we see as those connections here? Is that Nebuchadnezzar dreams of this multifaceted image, but what does he build instead? That he builds that his is going to be a full statue of gold, because his kingdom and his gods are the greatest, and his is the most powerful. And therefore, what does he do? We see this connection here that in some ways that Nebuchadnezzar just kind of takes it as a approval that he can do what he wants, how he wants in this life, because problems won't come until long into the future. Now, is that what God was trying to say with the dream? I don't think so. I think the dream was trying to get across that kingdoms do not last forever. Rulers do not last forever. That there is that constant, continued debasing of things that are there. But what does Nebuchadnezzar do? Well, I'm going to be different, and I'm going to now maybe have that, eat now and drink and have our pleasure, for someday we die. And so what do we see? We see Nebuchadnezzar not learning, not growing, not gaining, not heeding what God has for him. And so we see these connections here about how do we see the growth of the king versus how do we see the continued growth and development of Daniel and his friends. The king doesn't seem to be learning whatsoever. That we see those very repetitious realities. Once again, he's doing what ancient Near Eastern kings and despots do. They threaten and they kill and they rule with an iron fist of fear and violence and death. No one questions the king. And so we see that in not only the connections between the end of chapter 2 and chapter 3, but we also see a little bit of a connection between the beginning of chapter 2 and the beginning of chapter 3. That just like the long list of wise men brought together in Daniel 2, where it talked about that there was enchanters and magicians and sorcerers and indeed astrologers, that it just listed out this whole list of all of the wise men of Babylon were brought before Nebuchadnezzar, and none of them could help him. So also now, what do we see? We see this long list of political figures. These aren't just the advisors. These are the very rulers, those entrusted with an authority. So what difference can be detected between the different roles and responsibilities that are there, as well as what significance or importance is there that these are gathered? That as we hear of these satraps and governors, and that it gets down into all of those details, if we go back just a little bit, is that we see the governors and the counselors and the treasurers and the justices and the magistrates, is that you have those that rule large territories, those that rule smaller areas, those that govern simple cities and other local territories. That you had the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates. So what is it from the greatest down to the least. You have those in power and authority all gathered to this place where the king is going to make his statement. And so what's the importance and significance? Is that this is that continued political effort to solidify his name and his place in so many ways. And so what do we begin to see here? Is that what is that significance of the incorporation of music into these ceremonial requirements? Not only does he build this gigantic statue, but then he gathers all of those in authority. And then it goes through this laundry list that is repeated 3 or 4 or 5 times, I don't know. It just keeps coming up. That as we see that throughout, that what is it? It's not just a matter of bowing your knee to the statue and moving on, but there is the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the bagpipe, and every kind of music. And so I want you to stop and think about that for a second. Is that what's significant about the incorporation of music into this ceremonial requirement? What influence or impact does music have within our lives and within our society? That discuss, reflect, pause, take a moment to think about what does music have to offer in the midst of this. That we think about that whole idea that music stirs the emotions. It helps drive an atmosphere. It helps in some ways unite and connect. You think about political music, or you think about the fact that we ourselves are coming up on the celebration of the 4th of July, that we'll hear many patriotic anthems and tunes at parades, at firework displays, at different opportunities, that we will have that continued stirring of our emotion and our connection, of seeking to bring about unity, seeking to celebrate the gifts that are there within the freedoms of our nation. That music is used to help draw together the connections that we have as Americans. That certainly, that you look at other times, and different governments have used music in ways to stir nationalistic pride, stir very patriotic pushes within the government. That there's so many different ways that are there. But then you also think not just of the political side of music, but think about even the spiritual aspects of worship. That we so often incorporate music into our worship life. It's a part of who we are and how we celebrate God. And so what is it that Nebuchadnezzar is asking? That he's asking a bowing down. He's asking a bit of song and dance as this music is stirring the heart, stirring the emotion, stirring that connection, and leading them in this very way. And so we have to pause and we have to ask in our time that what's significant about how we use music? Do we use music only to be able to manipulate the emotions? Certainly we use music to set an atmosphere. Certainly we use it to create that space for us to explore and reflect. But should we use it to simply manipulate? Certainly not. That is it just a matter of connecting people in the external realities of life, or does there need to be a deeper connection there? I think we would all agree. And so King Nebuchadnezzar is once again trying to force that political alliance, that religious connection, seeking in so many ways to draw the hearts, the minds, and indeed the very lives in submission to everything that he is and what his gods have to offer. And so what are those motivations? Like we were just saying, that he is trying to accomplish something for his own political and his own legacy gain. And so King Nebuchadnezzar, he's not concerned about what's best for the people. He's not even concerned, I think, about what's best for his gods. Is that he, once again, is simply using power for power's sake. And I think sometimes we need to reflect. How in our life and in our time do we see people use power for power's sake? That we see that more in the rest of this account, in the lives not just of Nebuchadnezzar, but others. Is that verse 8? Therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans, or you can just insert, certain astrologers, came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. They declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the bagpipe, and every kind of music shall fall down and worship. That they shall worship the golden image, and whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the burning fiery furnace. Is this true? They lay it out before him. Is this the case? That there are certain Jews whom you yourself have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. And so as we see, once again, this tattle-tailing, once again, the wise men set up against the wisdom of these Jewish young men who've been placed in these roles. Is that what are some of those potential motivations of the king's, that should be the king's servants, turning over Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? That we see that it's, once again, their attempt out of jealousy, out of rivalry, out of competition for their personal gain, that they are ready to throw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego under the bus. That Nebuchadnezzar had commanded it. Wherever they indeed were placed within this very assembly, Nebuchadnezzar could not see them, but they were looking. I think it's kind of like that child in the Sunday school classroom when you all bow your heads in prayer and you see them just kind of eyeing what's going on. And then you as teacher get in trouble because you have your eyes open too. But what is it that they're doing? They're looking for a reason. They've probably been looking for a reason. For these men had grown to too high and too fast of a position that all were now jealous and seeking to bring them down. So how did these young men act? How do they respond to this? Is that then Nebuchadnezzar, in a furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought, and so they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? So that now, if you are ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, the pipe, well, we're just going to say the orchestra. We'll save ourselves. That I have made well and good, but if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into the burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands? So what's the king giving them? He's already given the threat that whoever does not bow down, that they shall be burned in the fiery furnace. But now what does he do? Is that he brings them before all of the rest, and he's going to make an example out of them. That it's not enough for us to suffer alone. So often the world desires to bring us before and use us as an example to others. But what is it that we see? What is it that we see in these young men's lives? So, I mean, when you think about putting yourself in their shoes, then what options did these three young men have in response to the king's edict? That if you were in this situation, what internal dialogue or debate might take place as you weighed the situation and your decision? So, I mean, what options did they have? I mean, a few of them were pretty straightforward. Don't bow and die. That you could bow and join in with the rest and abandon what you've done. Again, not a good option. That I think sometimes we start thinking not only about preservation, but we start thinking, well, I mean, the Lord knows my heart, doesn't he? That it's just an external action to bow down and to show this. That what could the harm be? The harm could be is that we wouldn't be in these powerful positions of influence. Is that what's God going to do without us there? Is that it would be better for us to go ahead and go along and get along as long as we can continue to have the roles that we do. See, isn't that kind of the way that our minds sometimes can work? We can come up with excuses as we weigh those decisions of why some decisions aren't as bad as they seem like they would be. But is that what the Lord desires? That the Lord desires not simply that we would take things into our own hands, but that we would follow him. See, this past week we had Vacation Bible School, and I was leading one of the stations called Sing and Play. We sang some songs, we played some games, we had some fun. But at one point I said, all right, everybody, we're done with this part of this. Let's go ahead and line up behind me and follow me outside. And sure enough, in almost every crew, there was 4 or 5 kids that ran out in front of me because they knew where they were going. They knew what was happening. They didn't need to follow. And I kind of had an insight as I said, if you're in front of me, you're not following me. Kind of the light bulb went off in my head. A discipleship lesson, let's just say, came to mind. The same is true in our discipleship when it comes to Jesus. That if we're not following him, if we're in front of him, we're not following him. The fact is that so often we desire to rush past what the Lord has. We know with impatience just what needs to happen. But what does God call us to? Not to rush ahead knowing that we know what is right, but indeed to be able to do what he has called us to. That faith is doing what, being faithful is that whole idea of doing not what is expedient, but doing what is right. And so certainly enough, we may find those tough decisions, but what are we called to? We're called to, with our words and our actions, give witness to what is ours. And so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer in this matter. If this be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from your very hand, O king. But if not, be it known, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. And so what's significant about the way that they respond? That how did they speak of God's plans for his people? And so they recognize that the king has authority. They recognize that there's no debate or discussion in this matter. But how do they approach it? That they approach it with the conviction of being able to say that if this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us. That they make a confession of who God is, that he is powerful and mighty, that he is the true God over all of these things. And yet, what is it that they are unwilling to do? To rush in front of God and say, he will do it. No, what do? But if not, then be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods. That whether God rescues or whether he doesn't, that is not up to us. That how God responds and how God acts, that is not our decision. See, what is it that the men do here? That they recognize the position and they are unwilling to simply waver, but yet they are unwilling to simply arm wrestle God into submission. No, they allow God to be God, accepting what may come, but in all things recognizing what he has given. And so this is as far as we're going to go in our study. We all know kind of the rest. We know the fact that God delivers them, that we have this whole idea of another joins them, that gift of Christ's presence who had led them through the fire and brought them out and gave a mighty testimony to the king. But as we've been looking at the life and time of Daniel and asking ourselves the question, that how do we live in a world that does not always support our faith? That how do we live in a world that in many ways is trying to form and fashion us in its image, to get us to bow to what its desires? That today I call and invite you to reflect upon what ways are we being called today to live in that faithfulness of our Lord? Where is it that we are being called forth to stand firm on God's truth? That as we think about these very men and their very unwavering trust, that where do we place our trust in the midst of these uncertain days? That may we place our trust in him who is able to deliver and able to save, and the one who goes with us. But may we put our trust in him who guides our steps each and every day as we live faithfully in his word. Thank you so much for joining us, and may God's blessings go with you this week.